Frank Warren's given a new interview to Simon Jordan where he delves more deeply into this Alexander Usyk Tyson Fury debacle. There were certain areas where I felt that he should have been challenged more by Simon Jordan and he wasn't, so we're going to do that here and call out Frank on a few things. And there were a couple of things as well where I felt that Simon Jordan made points that were a little bit unfair, so we're also going to look at those. Also, ADE Oladipo in one of his recent videos gave a really good analogy as to how he was interpreting the breakdown of this particular fight, and I want to build on that to reinforce a point that I made in my previous video, which was getting a lot of people up in their feelings, so we'll get into that as well. Frank starts off discussing the timeline and he's explaining that initially the Saudis wanted to make the fight in December 2022, and Simon Jordan says what, just a couple of months after AJ fought Usyk, and the insinuation there is that that's unrealistic. Well, actually Usyk AJ took place in August, 3 to 4 months before, so that wouldn't have been unrealistic, but AJ was informed of the intention to make the fight 8 or 9 weeks before the fight, so obviously that doesn't really give him much time to prepare. He's had back-to-back losses, he's had a really difficult year in terms of pushing his body to the max, he's changed trainers, he's done X, Y and Z, he's now currently without a trainer, something that Frank Warren pointed out, and we'll talk about that in a moment. He's clearly not ready to take on this fight. And Frank says, okay, fair enough, I get it. Initially, AJ, I believe, would have wanted the fight, he says, but I believe he was talked out of that. But I get it, but then don't waste our time for 6 weeks. The problem is, Frank, you always have to listen to somebody's offer. If you've gone to him with an offer, if he was to decline it outright, you would have come out and you would have said, see, Anthony Joshua didn't want the fight. We went to them and they didn't even entertain us. So when they do entertain you, why are you complaining that you had your time wasted? He listened to your offer. He contemplated it. He actually said he would take the fight. Deadlines were set that were just not realistic, and he wasn't able to make the fight occur. And not only were those deadlines not realistic, the deadlines were set with a view to making the Usyk fight happen early the following year. And then that fight didn't materialize. So you can't blame Anthony Joshua for that. Now, in that period of time, though, Alexander Usyk, the reason they started talking to Anthony Joshua is because Alexander Usyk said that he needed a break. And a lot of the Fury fans at the time were saying, see, this is proof that Alexander Usyk doesn't want to fight. He's trying to delay here. He's not ready for Tyson Fury. And at the time, I came out and I said, I'm sorry, you can't say that at all. It's an undisputed title fight. I want both fighters to be at their best when they're in the ring against each other. If Alexander Usyk, who has himself had a difficult year, feels the need to take a break, then I've got no problem with that. By the same token, I kept that energy just to show you how consistent I am and how I don't take sides unfairly. When people then started criticizing Tyson Fury for wanting a fight in the interim and he wanted to make the Chisora fight, and they were saying, why is he taking this fight? What happens if he gets a cut? What happens if he picks up a knock and it delays the Usyk fight? This is proof that he doesn't want the Usyk fight. Again, I jumped to the defense of the fighter and I was saying, hold on a sec. If Tyson Fury feels the need to take this fight in order to be 100%, like I've always been saying, I want both guys at their best. I've got no problem with it. Yes, the choice of opponent was not one that interested me really. It wasn't a fight I wanted to see in that regard. We all would have preferred him to fight AJ or Josh or Joyce or whoever else. But I, in theory, do not have a problem with keep busy fights in the interim that are gimme fights, in the same way that I didn't have one when Yildirim was going to fight Canelo Alvarez in between Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders. But fine, keep fit as long as the fight happens early next year. But Frank then goes on to say the Saudis came back and they said they can't put on the fight until April. And then after that, they came back at us again and said this is not going to work and we can't get it on until November or December because the stadium can't be completed. Now, this is a line that Frank Warren has continued to push. And there have been rumors that the reason that the fight deal broke down is because although Alexander Usyk accepted what was offered to him, Tyson Fury was asking for too much money. In which case, who's responsible, Frank, for the fight not happening? And this is something that needs to be challenged on. Are you sure it's the stadium, Frank? Did the Saudis really say that? Somebody needs to go and interview the representatives of the Saudi Arabians who wanted to put on the fight and ask, what is the reason this fell through? Were there any problems in the negotiations with Tyson Fury and the Saudis when it came to making the fight, and did that delay cause a problem? Or was it you guys that out of the blue decided that you couldn't host it? In other words, if Tyson Fury had agreed his side with you guys, would you have still turned around and said, actually, we're pulling the plug because we want this particular stadium? We've got other venues, but we want this stadium to be the highlight of the event, to host the event, to bring prestige onto the nation, and as a result of that, we're not ready to make the fight now. This is a key component that somebody needs to ask. I know ID Boxing have got some contacts over there. I think Seconds Out as well interviewed somebody from there. Someone needs to ask that question. It's a key thing. Now, going back to the whole Anthony Joshua negotiation issue, one of the things that Frank Warren points to say, look, I'm telling the truth about this, we wanted to fight and it was their side that didn't, is the fact that Frank Smith had said that Anthony Joshua did not have enough time and that he didn't even have a trainer and stuff like that. In other words, the relationship between fighter and trainer and who's available and stuff like that is determining whether Anthony Joshua wanted to fight, according to Frank Warren. That is a piece of evidence, right? Well, if that's the case, how do you explain the piece of evidence regarding Sugar Hill Stewart not being in camp for Tyson Fury? Now, I know a lot of Fury fans will turn around and say, hold up a sec, Chris. In the past, Sugar Hill Stewart has joined camp quite late, 6 weeks out before the fight and stuff like that, for the Dillian Whyte fights, for the Derek Chisora fights, because he uses Andy Lee early on. He's also a professional trainer. He had his nutritionist in. He had some sparring partners in. So clearly this doesn't apply, Chris. However, this is somewhat different because he didn't have, reportedly, a southpaw sparring partner in camp, which is not ideal if you're preparing for Alexander Usyk, to say the least. And additionally to that, Sugar Hill Stewart himself didn't seem aware that he was there to be training Tyson Fury. So what is Frank Warren talking about here? His own words were that he was here to train a collie, and as far as he was concerned, he was going back to the United States and no one had informed him of anything. There's certainly nothing to suggest that 6 weeks out that Sugar Hill Stewart was there to train Fury. So if the trainer's presence is your sign of intent, well, then there's no intent from Tyson Fury to make the fight either, is there, Frank? Now, going on from that, he's also talking about the whole rematch situation and why it was suggested by Team Fury. And he's basically saying now, listen, Usyk had some mandatories that he had to take care of. And he's saying that the first fight would have been for Undisputed, there's no doubt about it. But the second fight, they would have been under pressure because Dubois would have been there, Hrgovic, Joe Joyce, all would have been in line to have mandatory shots, and Usyk would have had to have defended against them. Frank also goes on to say that the Saudis had implied that wanting to host the fight had a lot to do with the prestige of an undisputed title fight. And as a result of it not being undisputed, the rematch, who knows whether they would have wanted to have hosted the rematch. He also goes on to say that he admits that if the Saudis were still involved, the fight would have happened. Not from Fury's perspective, but from Usyk's, because he would have got the sort of money that he would have felt he deserved to be paid. But the problem is, Frank, we go back to why the fight is not in Saudi Arabia. This is why it's such a key component to establish this. Because if it was down to Tyson Fury, which is what I strongly suspect, and I think most people suspect, being too greedy and delaying the process, well, number one, you've caused a delay, which leads to the fact that the rematch has to be pushed back, which means you're more likely to have the mandatories called. And number two, Usyk's then getting less money as a result of it. So what are you talking about, Frank? See, the problem that Frank Warren has here is that he's in a position where he has to try and defend the indefensible. He has to find a way to find an excuse for Tyson Fury. So whilst he does make some points, which we'll go on to in a moment, which are strong points, because they're married with points that are just ridiculous, you cannot defend Fury's conduct in this situation, it puts himself in a very difficult position. For instance, he also goes on to say, you know what killed this fight? Social media half killed this fight. The problem is, as Simon Jordan points out, it's your job to promote. Why aren't you telling Tyson Fury to shut his mouth and stay off of social media? Now, when he was challenged with this, Simon Jordan had said, I know I've told you this before, and you said, well, you try telling him. In other words, he's got a mind of his own. You can't control Tyson Fury. In which case, what does that mean, Frank? It means that Tyson Fury is sabotaging the potential of the fight. If he's so arrogant and he's such a loudmouth that he cannot stop himself from partaking in a process which jeopardizes the fight, then he's directly contributing to the jeopardizing of the fight. He's responsible. So at the end of the video, when Frank seems to take exception to the fact that everybody's blaming Tyson Fury, what are you taking exception for, Frank? Your own logic is telling us that he's the one that's doing the actions that are leading to the fight being jeopardized. And finally, when he's asked about the rumors that the two sides between Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk will be exchanging contracts over the coming week, Frank Warren says, I haven't heard anything about this. Where have you heard anything about this? And he wants AJ to fight Dubois or Joyce in a bid to get into a mandatory position. Here's the thing, Frank. If you've already discussed things and you've agreed in principle, which is what you've been saying, and what Eddie Hearn admitted recently that you guys had all agreed in principle, why wouldn't you want the fight now? You didn't want to fight Anthony Joshua because there was, or rather you set strict deadlines, right? Because you had to make the Alexander Usyk fight happen early. Well, unless something occurs now to reinstate the position of Usyk and Fury to make them fight in the summer, why wouldn't you take Anthony Joshua next? Now there's no excuse. So now we start talking about if he wants to fight again and all this talk about possible retirement. It's ludicrous. This is a sort of stuff that is just a PR disaster for Team Fury at the moment. And this is why a lot of Fury fans are turning against Tyson Fury. But there are one or two things where Frank Warren deserves to be defended. And one of those examples comes when he's talking about the interview that both he and Krasik had where they were on TalkSport together. And Simon Jordan says, listen, Krasik blatantly tried to do a drive-by assassination, he calls it, where he comes on the show, he spits his own facts sort of thing and then disappears off into the sunset and he's not challenged. But Frank didn't let him do that because he went on live at the same time. And one of the things that he was challenged on is that Krasik, without elaborating on specifics, said that it would take 15 minutes to explain exactly why the fight fell apart. And Frank said this is rubbish because we overcame all the potential obstacles except for one. There was one sticking point, and that was the split for the rematch clause. So when he challenged Krasik on this, Krasik did not push back. This is true. And Frank then goes on to read a statement from Krasik where he says, listen, I'm not blaming Queensberry. I'm not even blaming Tyson Fury. There's just a problem on how he estimates himself. In other words, how he values himself. And basically, Alexander Usyk and Team Usyk had decided to go another route. They'd had enough, basically. Now, that's not necessarily proof of anything because you could just be in a situation where you're trying to be amicable with how you deliver something because you don't want to cause a beef and you want to be able to work together in future. So that's not necessarily evidence to say, oh, look, they're not even blaming Tyson Fury. It's quite clear that Team Usyk are not happy with Team Fury, right? You don't need to read me that statement to convince me otherwise. However, one of the things that does add credence to what I said in my last video, which people were getting up in their feelings about, is that Frank Warren was saying he was not convinced it was dead in the water and that he was going to call Alex Krasik directly after the interview. Krasik was aware of that. That was all known on air. People still had hope that maybe they could find a solution. But Krasik had told him Usyk's already out of camp. He's back in Kiev. And Frank Warren saying it was impossible to get from Turkey and camp in Turkey to Kiev in a single day. So what blatantly happened is on the Sunday, after they'd spoken and they'd bypassed all these problems that they had, they went back to Alexander Usyk, they informed Usyk, and Usyk said, F this, I'm leaving. And it's at that point that I was saying in that last video that wound a lot of people up, that the pride of Alexander Usyk got in the way. You may feel it was a righteous move. There was righteous indignation there from Alexander Usyk. I'm not absolving Fury of responsibility. If Fury wanted to fight, as much as Usyk wanted to fight, it would get signed. So no one's saying that Fury wanted to fight and Usyk didn't. But in that moment, Usyk's pride got in the way. And I'm going to use an analogy that ADE Oladipo used, and I'm going to build on it to explain exactly what it is that I'm talking about in the hope of waking a few people up to this fact, because for some reason people have been coming at me and saying things like, what are you talking about, Chris? Tyson Fury didn't want the fight. How is any of that relevant to the point I've made that pride affected Alexander Usyk at the last hurdle? I'm telling you, I accept that. I know that Tyson Fury did not act in a way which suggests he wanted to fight. He didn't want the fight. Now, I don't know why he didn't want the fight. Could it be that he felt he was going to lose? Maybe he feels Alexander Usyk's better than him, right? Maybe he feels, I could beat Usyk, but I know he's a significant threat. And because of the persona that I've created about this undefeated Fury and no man from his mother can beat me, it would cause such damage to my brand that it's such a big risk for me. This is why I'm demanding 70-30, because of what I've got to lose. I've got to be in a position where I could potentially cash out from these fights, because I could never be the same again. Just like when Nassim Hamed lost his first fight, he fought one more fight after that, but he was never the same again and he never fought again. These sorts of larger-than-life characters, once they lose and they lose that aura, it could really affect their careers. Maybe that's the reason. Or maybe he wanted to age Usyk out. He wanted to ensure that Usyk, who's a mobility-based fighter, takes on a bit more damage and he can fight him at a weakened state down the line when he's a little bit older. He might be looking at it and saying, you know what, Floyd Mayweather, nobody holds it against him for delaying the Pacquiao fight. People just assume Floyd was the greatest of his generation. I'm going to benefit from that too. All of those things are in line with a duck. You'd have to call that a duck. The only possible explanation which isn't a duck is if Fury is secretly carrying injuries, as Babic has said, and he's delaying in the hope of healing. But he doesn't want to let anybody know what his injuries are, right? When Gary Russell Jr. had that shoulder injury and he made it known, Magsayo went and punched him straight on the shoulder and injured his shoulder and he could only use one hand for the rest of the fight. Maybe you don't want to allow people to know where you're weakened. So maybe he's trying to hide that and he was just trying to buy himself time. That would also mean that he's responsible for the fight not happening, but it's a more understandable situation. Either way, Alexander Usyk did his utmost to make the fight happen. So no one's critical of Usyk. But to give you that analogy, ADE Oladipo in one of his recent videos was saying, imagine I'm offered a job And in that job, it's one that I don't really want. I might seek to find a way out without burning bridges. So I might turn around and say, I want X amount of money for this job. All of a sudden, they tell me they're going to pay me, and I didn't expect them to meet my demands. So now I'm like, oh my God, man, now what am I going to do? I've got to take the job. No, wait, I've got to find another way out of this. I'm going to tell them I want to fly first class. Now, if I tell them I want to fly first class, they're not going to meet that demand. They don't do that for anybody. But then guess what? They meet that demand. All of a sudden, ADE's backed into a corner. Now, what am I going to do? Everything I'm doing to put an obstacle in the way, they're meeting that demand. I've either got to come out now and say, actually, guys, I don't want the job, which could potentially burn bridges and ruin my reputation for messing around this potential employer, or I've got to just take the job and take it on the chin. Now, to build on that analogy, this is what I am saying happened, though. Imagine that company, that potential employer of ADE Oladipo, got so wound up with his conduct, they turned around and they said, you know what, this guy's been taking the piss. So, ADE, yeah, we're going to meet all your demands, but you know what, in the next job you're going to get, we're not going to pay you what you're asking for. You're going to get less than what you would typically get elsewhere, less than what is the typical going rate. We're paying you a lot more for the going rate for the first time, for the first job, but for the second job, you're going to have to show some, goodwill and take it at a cheaper rate. Well, they're not necessarily wrong to conduct themselves like that. But what that does is it opens a trapdoor and says to ADE Oladipo, there's your exit. There's your opportunity to turn down the job now without losing face and just say, look, guys, I'm really sorry. The zone have offered me another job. I've got a better opportunity coming from there. And therefore, ADE Oladipo protects his reputation. A potential employer is not going to look at that and say, this guy is just really difficult to employ. They're going to look at that and say, well, actually, he's looking at the bottom line. We're going to have to make sure we offer a little bit more money to ensure that we secure him. Right? You give the guy an out. You've opened the trap door and said, go and escape through there. Now, that doesn't mean that company didn't really want to sign ADE Oladipo. They clearly did want to hire him. In the same way that clearly Alexander Usyk wanted to fight against Tyson Fury. It was ADE Oladipo that didn't want to take the job, and it was Tyson Fury that didn't really want to take the fight. But you can't deny the fact that in that specific moment, that decision was based on principle. In other words, pride. I will not be walked all over. I will not bow my head. Like I said in the last video, that was the phrase that Krasik used. I will not keep bowing my head. Principle became more important than making the fight. That's not necessarily morally wrong or anything like that. Many of you will say it's righteous indignation, but it scuppered the situation in that moment. Which brings us on to the question as to whether Alexander Usyk's demands of 70-30 in his favour for the rematch were actually reasonable. If they're reasonable, then it has nothing to do with pride, Chris. It's got to do with business. So a number of you were trying to make the argument that there isn't actually a gap between Fury and Usyk as a brand in the British market. And I explained in the previous video why that was not the case. But further evidence has emerged to further reinforce my position on that, and I'll share that with you in a moment. But also, in addition to that, Simon Jordan tried to question the gap between Fury and Usyk in an American market. And he points to the fact that Wilder Ortiz did 275,000 buys, whilst Wilder Fury 1 did 325k buys. In other words, it's only a 50k addition in terms of pay-per-view buys. He can't be that big of a star. Sure, Simon, but that was for the first fight. In the second fight, Fury Wilder 2 did 850,000 buys. In the third fight, it did 600,000 buys. So should Alexander Usyk go over there and fight some big American stars, Wilder, Ruiz, whatever, if he was to go over there and fight 3 times, I'm sure his brand would grow significantly too. But in the meantime, there's a gap. And with regards to those that try to tell me that there isn't a gap between Fury and Usyk in a British market, in addition to what I was saying before, where I was basing that on inflated figures of Alexander Usyk, well, now it's emerged that those figures are actually wider in terms of gap. You can go and watch Boxing Social's interview with Eddie Hearn, uploaded 5 days ago. New effing rule is how the title starts. He explains that Chisora and Usyk did something like 300,000 buys. From 7 months ago, if you go and check out ID Boxing's video, Eddie Hearn Passionate, Anthony Joshua rant over must-win Usyk rematch, he explains that the first fight between AJ and Usyk did 700,000 buys. So this idea that there's no commercial gap between Fury and Usyk in a Western market, including the British, is just rubbish. And Frank Warren made the comment that I made in my previous video. If Usyk was to fight Hrgovic next, how many pay-per-views do you think it does in the UK? But there is a glimmer of hope. Frank Warren did say the only way this fight could potentially happen in the UK in the summer is if Daniel Dubois accepts step-aside money. For goodness sake, get behind the negotiating table, away from cameras, negotiate better splits that both guys will feel happy with, and get this fight done. This is history, this is legacy that's on the line. Please let me know what you think, ladies and gents. Don't forget to hit a stiff jab on the like button, a right cross on the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.